Widow begged to cook for cold rancher, until his daughter whispered, "Please stay before we start the story. Leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story." The snow fell in thick, unbroken sheets, swallowing the edges of the Wyoming horizon until the world itself seemed made of white silence. The year was 1892, and the Bitter Creek train station was little more than a platform with a tin roof, rattling under the weight of winter. When the locomotive screeched to a halt, its wheels grinding against ice-crusted rails, a hiss of steam split the air. Out of that veil stepped a woman, shoulders squared against the wind, though her body trembled with exhaustion. Her name was Clara Bennett, and at 26 she looked far older than her years. Grief and hard labor had carved their story into her frame. She wore a faded wool dress patched at the elbows, a thin shawl pulled tight around her broad shoulders. Her boots, scuffed and weary from too many miles, sank into the snow as if reluctant to carry her any further. In her right hand she held a wooden suitcase tied at the hinges with twine. In her left, pressed to her chest, was a small leather pouch, worn, cracked, and precious, for inside it lay her only chance, left a letter. The people on the platform noticed her immediately. A man whispered, "That's her, isn't it?" Another nodded grimly, "The miner's widow. Lost her husband in the blast, poor thing. Folks say no one keeps her long." A woman sniffed and pulled her shawl tighter, muttering she ought to have stayed where she belonged. Clara heard it all. She always did. The whispers clung to her like the coal dust that had once covered her husband's clothes when he returned home from the mines. She had buried him in the same collapse that had nearly buried her spirit. His family, cold with bitterness, had turned her away afterward. No children, no reason to stay, they had told her. She had left with nothing but her hands and her stubborn will to survive. That will had carried her here to this frozen platform where she opened the pouch with trembling fingers. The letter was creased from being read 100 times, its words blunt and unsentimental. "Mrs. Bennett, I require a cook at my ranch. The work will be long, the conditions plain. I do not offer comfort, only pay. If you can manage, come. Matthew Carter." To most, the tone would have sounded more command than invitation. But to Clara, it had been salvation. She folded the paper again, pressed it to her lips, then tucked it back inside the pouch. With a slow breath, she hefted her suitcase and stepped toward the waiting wagon that would take her to the Carter Ranch. The journey was long, a blur of frozen fields and black lines of pine. When at last the wagon crested a rise, Clara saw the ranch house tall and solid against the storm. It was no welcoming sight. Its beams were sturdy, its roof pitched high to fight the snow, but it stood more like a fortress than a home. Beside it loomed barns and corrals, shadowed shapes of cattle grazing against the vast white plain. Her boots sank deep as she stepped down from the wagon. The door of the house opened before she could reach it. A man filled the frame, broad-shouldered, tall, his coat buttoned tight against the wind. His hair was dark, streaked with gray, his eyes sharp and shadowed, carrying a weight that seemed heavier than the storm itself. Matthew Carter. His gaze moved from her worn suitcase to the pouch clutched in her hand. Not a flicker of welcome crossed his face. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the whistle of the wind. At last, his voice cut through, flat and unyielding. "I hired a cook. Not a guest. The words struck like a lash. Clara's throat tightened, but she lifted her chin, refusing to flinch. This was her last chance. She stepped inside anyway. The kitchen told her everything she needed to know about the house. Smoke-stained walls, cobwebs hanging from corners, a single iron stove rusted at the hinges. The shelves held dented kettles and chipped plates, utensils dulled from years of neglect. It was a room built for survival, not warmth, just like the man himself. Clara set her suitcase down and pulled flour-dried beans and a few root vegetables from the pantry. She tied her shawl tighter and got to work. Her fingers moved quickly, slicing onions, chopping carrots. She coaxed life into the stove, the flames sputtering against her raw knuckles. But the fire burned too hot. The pot hissed smoke, rising bitter and sharp. She coughed, fanning the air with her apron. Too late, the stew had scorched. The kitchen door swung open. Matthew stepped in, boots striking the floor like thunder. His eyes swept the smoke, then fixed on her with unrelenting judgment. "If you want charity, go elsewhere. I need work done here." The wooden spoon trembled in her grip. She bit her lip hard, scraping the ruined stew into a bucket. Pride screamed in her chest, but desperation bound her to silence. She began again, peeling potatoes with steady strokes, starting over despite the burn in her cheeks. Matthew lingered in the doorway, arms crossed, then left without another word. That night, as she scrubbed the scorched pot until her knuckles bled, Clara thought of every place that had turned her away. She thought of her husband's face, now blurred in memory, and the promise she had made to herself, "I will not be broken." The sound of bare feet pattering across the floor startled her. She turned to see a small figure in the doorway, a little girl, curls of brown hair tumbling into wide eyes. She clutched a ragged doll to her chest. Emma Carter. Her voice was small, uncertain, but filled with curiosity. "Are you going to stay?" Clara bent slightly, her heart tightening. In the child's eyes, she saw something she had not seen in years: hope. Before she could answer, Matthew's voice came from behind. "She cooks, that's all." Emma's shoulders slumped, but her gaze never wavered. She stared at Clara as if willing her to remain. And for the first time that day, Clara felt a thread of belonging, not from the man who had hired her, but from the child who wanted her there. Clara rose each morning before the sky softened with dawn. The Carter ranch still slept beneath its blanket of snow, the cattle huddled against the wind, the fields gray with frost. She lit the stove with stiff fingers, coaxing sparks into flame until the iron glowed. While the rest of the house stirred, slowly awake, Clara scrubbed, stitched, and scoured. The kitchen that had once smelled only of soot began to carry hints of bread and herbs. Curtains long torn she mended with patient hands. Even Matthew's shirts, threadbare at the cuffs, found their seams reinforced by her careful needle. Through it all, Emma was never far. Each morning, the little girl padded into the kitchen, her curls tangled, dragging her ragged doll across the floor. She perched on a stool legs, swinging, watching every motion with solemn fascination. "Tell me a story," she would say, her small voice insistent. Clara obliged. She told tales from her own childhood of flowers that grew stubbornly between stones, of sparrows that carried messages between miners when words were too heavy to shout. Emma listened with round eyes, her laughter breaking through the silence of the Carter house like a song after a long winter. Even Matthew noticed. Though he said little, Clara caught the way his stride slowed when he heard Emma's giggles echoing down the hall. She saw how his eyes lingered a heartbeat longer on the doorway when Clara and Emma bent together over dough or whispered over storybooks Emma had begged from the neighbors. But Matthew's walls were tall, built from grief and silence. One night, the house was quiet, lamplight low, and Matthew carried Emma up the narrow stairs. Clara stayed below, folding linens at the table. She heard the creak of the floor above the soft rumble of a father's voice. "Good night, sweetheart." Then came the words that changed everything. Papa Emma whispered, her voice carrying down the stairwell. "Can she tuck me in too?" The question struck like glass shattering in a still room. Clara froze, the folded sheet slipping from her hands. Upstairs, Matthew stiffened his hand, hovering over his daughter's quilt. He looked into Emma's pleading eyes filled with a longing he could never erase alone. His chest tightened, the weight of memory pressing hard, yet his answer came clipped sharp and flat. "She's only here to cook." The silence that followed was heavier than the winter storm outside. Emma turned her face into the pillow shoulders, trembling. Clara stood halfway up the stairs, her heart aching at the sound. Those words weren't meant for her, yet they cut her as if they had been. She returned quietly to the kitchen, pressed her palms hard against the table, fighting tears she had promised never to shed again. She's only here to cook. That night, she lay on the narrow cot beside the pantry, staring at the low beams above her head. She told herself she should have expected nothing more. She was a widow with no family, no claim, no right. Still, Emma's voice echoed inside her chest. Why did a child's plea feel like a wound she could not close? The answer came suddenly, in the dark hours before dawn, when Emma's cry pierced the silence. Clara bolted upright and rushed to the girl's room. She found her tossing under the covers, cheeks flushed crimson, hair damp with sweat. Her breaths came shallow, too fast. Matthew was already there, pacing with a basin of cold water clutched in his large hands. His jaw was tight, his movements clumsy with panic. He wrung a rag and pressed it to Emma's brow. She whimpered, turning away. His hands trembled. His voice cracked. "I don't know what to do," he muttered harshly, fear roughening every word. "Let me," Clara said softly. He hesitated. For a moment, pride battled desperation in his eyes. Then, with a rough exhale, he yielded the basin. Clara sat on the bed, smoothing Emma's damp curls back with practiced fingers. She dipped a cloth in warm water she had boiled, wrung it carefully, and laid it across the child's brow. "It has to be warm," she explained gently, though she did not look up. "Cold shocks the body when it's already fighting." Matthew said nothing, only folded his arms as if bracing himself against helplessness. Hour after hour, Clara tended Emma. She brewed a tea of chamomile and willow bark, coaxed small sips past parched lips, whispered stories until Emma's eyes fluttered between wakefulness and sleep. When the fever spiked, Clara began to sing. Her voice was low, steady, carrying an old hymn her mother had once hummed when sorrow was too heavy to bear. The melody filled the room, weaving through the stillness like a thread of light. From the doorway, Matthew stood unmoving, his tall frame shadowed against the hall. He leaned one hand against the doorframe, listening. It had been years since music had touched these walls. His house had been silent for so long that he had nearly forgotten what hope sounded like. The hymn stirred something inside him, prying at cracks in a heart long walled off. His lips parted. Words slipped out before he could stop them. I'd forgotten what a lullaby sounded like. Clara did not answer. She kept singing, her hand resting firmly on Emma's small fingers. Slowly, Emma's breathing eased her fever, breaking in a sheen of sweat. Her little hand clutched at Clara's skirt, refusing to let go. When at last exhaustion claimed her, Clara slumped against the bed, her head bowed, her body bent in devotion and weariness. Her dark hair fell loose across her face. Matthew's chest tightened as he watched. Quietly, he stepped forward. He lifted a blanket from the foot of the bed and draped it across her shoulders. His fingers lingered, brushing the fabric near her hand before he withdrew. For the first time in years, the lines carved into his face softened. He turned away, leaving the lamplight to flicker over the woman and child, two lights burning together in a house long forgotten by song. The storm that struck a week later came without warning. The morning had been calm, the fields lying beneath a pale sky, the air still and brittle. But by afternoon, a dark haze rose on the horizon. The wind howled, rattling shutters and slamming barn doors against their frames. Dust and grit swirled across the land, stinging the eyes and biting at the skin. Clara was in the yard with Emma, who had been chasing a stray kitten darting between snowdrifts. "Come back, sweetheart," Clara called, quickening her pace as the girl's small legs carried her toward the stables. But Emma's giggles were swallowed by the sudden roar. The wind hit like a wall. Shingles tore from the roof and hurtled into the sky. The barn doors banged wide, sucked inward by the gale. Clara lunged, grabbing Emma and clutching her tight. Dust-laden air choked her lungs. Inside the barn, the rafters groaned. A crack split the air, sharp and final. Clara looked up in time to see a heavy beam lurch free. Instinct overcame fear. She shoved Emma beneath her own body, arms spread wide, bracing for the blow. The beam crashed down, striking her shoulder and pinning her against the dirt floor. White-hot pain shot through her body, but she held Emma close, shielding the child with every ounce of strength she had left. Papa Emma screamed, muffled against Clara's dress. Clara's own voice tore raw against the storm. "Help! We're here!" She screamed again, throat-burning, lungs filling with dust. The weight bore down on her arms, but she refused to yield. Outside, Matthew Carter had seen the barn sway, the roofline tilting dangerously. He ran headlong into the gale coat, whipping behind him. "Emma!" he bellowed, though the wind shredded his cry. He forced his way through flying debris, heart pounding with terror. Inside, he stumbled over fallen boards, straining his ears against the roar. Then he heard it, a hoarse cry. Clara's. He lunged forward, forcing himself through the chaos until his hands found the beam crushing her. Beneath it, he saw what nearly undid him, his daughter, trembling in Clara's arms, Clara's own face streaked with dust and blood, yet refusing to move lest the child bear the weight. Matthew roared, planting his back beneath the beam. His muscles strained, cords standing out along his neck. With a surge of strength born from desperation, he heaved. The beam shifted, groaned, then gave way. He flung it aside. Emma scrambled into his arms, sobbing, her small body shaking. Matthew held her against his chest, pressing his lips into her hair, breathing her in as though she had been lost forever. Then he turned to Clara. She still knelt, shoulders trembling, blood trickling at her temple. Matthew hauled her to her feet, pulling her against him as if she were as vital as air itself. His voice broke raw, stripped bare. "I can't lose her," he said hoarsely, clutching Emma with one arm and Clara with the other. His eyes burned into Clara's. "Or you." The words stunned her. She blinked through dust, her breath catching. For so long she had been unwanted, dismissed, cast aside. To hear those words, confession wrapped in fear and tenderness, was almost more than she could hold. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Matthew tore off his coat and wrapped it around them both, bundling Emma and Clara against his chest, his broad frame shielding them from the storm's fury. Together they staggered out of the collapsing barn, the gale still howling, dust tearing at their faces. Only when they reached the house did Matthew stop, his chest heaving. He set Emma down gently, brushing dirt from her hair, then turned back to Clara. His hands lingered longer than necessary at her shoulders, as if making sure she was real, as if she hadn't nearly been crushed before his eyes. The storm passed by mourning, leaving the barn in ruins. Beams lay scattered like broken bones across the frozen earth. Yet inside the Carter house, something had shifted. At breakfast, Matthew did not retreat into silence. He lingered at the table, his voice softer, as he asked if the bread had risen enough, if the stew carried enough salt. It was not much, but it was more than he had given in years. In the days that followed, Emma bloomed under the new warmth. She clung to Clara openly now, tugging her into games, demanding stories by the fire. At night, Matthew returned from the yard to find them bent together over a book, Clara's arm wrapped protectively around Emma's shoulders. He said little, but his gaze lingered longer each time, as though he were memorizing a sight he did not want to lose. One evening, as Clara sat mending near the stove, Matthew paused at the doorway. He watched her hands move steadily, the lamplight catching in her dark hair. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then, with a quietness that surprised even him, he said, "You risked your life for her. For Emma." Clara looked up, startled. She opened her mouth, but he raised a hand, his eyes fixed on hers. "And for me." The silence that followed was not the cold absence she had once feared, but something different, something that carried weight and the promise of change. The Carter house felt different after the storm, as though the walls themselves had softened. Matthew no longer carried the same distance in his stride. At meals, his voice joined theirs, not booming, not commanding, but steady and warmer than before. He asked how the bread had risen, whether the porridge was too thin, if Clara needed more flour from town. For a man, once content to eat in silence, these questions felt like sunlight breaking through cloud. Emma thrived in the new rhythm. She clung to Clara with the certainty of a child who had found what she needed most. Whether tugging Clara into games of dolls or curling against her side with a book, the girl no longer hid her affection. In her eyes, Clara was no longer a stranger, but a part of her world. One afternoon, while folding linens upstairs, Clara pulled open a drawer she hadn't touched before. Beneath a stack of shirts lay a delicate square of fabric. She lifted it gently, smoothing it across her palm. It was a handkerchief embroidered at the edges with blue thread. In the corner, stitched in neat script, was a single name, Anna. Her breath caught. She knew, without asking, who it had belonged to, Matthew's late wife. For a moment, Clara felt as though she had trespassed into sacred ground. She set the cloth down, carefully ready to close the drawer, when Matthew's voice broke the quiet behind her. "You found it." She turned, startled. He stood in the doorway, his hands resting at his sides, his eyes fixed on the handkerchief. His voice, when he spoke, carried no anger, only heaviness. "I should have put it away years ago. But I couldn't. I thought if I let it go, it would mean I had betrayed her, as though loving again meant forgetting. Clara's throat tightened. She held the fabric close to her heart. For years, she had carried her own grief, the weight of losing her husband, the sting of rejection, the shame of whispers. Now she saw that Matthew bore his grief differently, locked away in silence that had nearly consumed him. Their eyes met, and for the first time his were unshielded. His words came low steady. I thought letting go meant betrayal, but maybe it means learning to love again. Clara blinked back tears, her voice trembling as she answered. Your daughter already knows. She chose me long before you did. The air between them seemed to still. Then, slowly, Matthew reached forward, his rough hand closing gently around hers. His grip was firm, almost reverent, and Clara let her tears fall, not from sorrow, but from the quiet knowledge that she was no longer alone in carrying her heart. The days lengthened into spring. Snow melted, rivers swelled, and the valley bloomed in tender green. For the first time in years, Matthew agreed to attend the town festival. It had been Emma's idea. Please, Papa, she had begged, tugging at his sleeve, and bring Miss Clara, too. The square buzzed with laughter and music. Lanterns hung from wagon wheels. Fiddlers tuned their strings. Boots stomped in rhythm on packed earth. Clara adjusted the hem of her plain cotton dress, its color unremarkable, yet lending her a quiet dignity. People paused to glance twice, surprised at the change in her bearing. Where once she had been marked only by loss, now she carried herself with a steadiness born of belonging. Matthew stood stiffly at the edge of the crowd, broad shoulders casting a long shadow. His discomfort was clear. He had never been one for gatherings. Yet, when he turned to Clara, something shifted. His throat worked before words found him. I haven't danced since my wedding, he admitted, voice rough with memory. His hand hovered uncertainly, palm open, as though unused to the gesture. But would you? Clara's breath caught. For a heartbeat, she simply stared, her heart pounding against her ribs. Then she placed her hand into his. His grip closed around hers, tentative at first, then steady. They stepped into the circle of dancers, lantern light spilling across their faces. Matthew's movements were stiff, awkward, but Clara guided him with patience. Slowly, his stride found rhythm. Around them, fiddles sang, banjos rang, boots stomped in time. The music swirled, carrying them together. He bent his head, his words murmured low enough for her alone. I thought loving you meant forgetting her, but now I see it means remembering her with less pain. Because you showed me how. Tears blurred Clara's vision. She tightened her grip, whispering back, then let's not forget. Let's live. The music swelled, the crowd circling them, sensing the gravity of the moment. When the song faded, Matthew stopped. His chest rose and fell heavy with something more than exertion. Then, in full view of the town, he dropped to one knee on the earthen floor. From his coat pocket, he drew a simple silver ring, its surface dulled with age but etched with care. His voice carried loud and steady, not only for Clara, but for all who had gathered. Not as my cook, not only as the woman who saved my child, but as the one I want to choose every day. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, tears spilling freely. She nodded, unable to form words. The square fell silent, lanterns flickering as if the night itself held its breath. Then Emma's voice rang clear, high, and unrestrained. She said, yes. The crowd erupted. Boots stomped, Hands clapped, fiddles struck a jubilant chord. Matthew rose, slipping the ring onto Clara's trembling hand. He pulled her close, and for the first time in years his face broke into a smile, unshadowed by loss, filled instead with light. And Clara, with Emma rushing into her skirts, felt a truth settle deep inside her. This was not mercy, not pity. It was choice, and it was hers at last. The years that followed softened the Carter Ranch as surely as the seasons shaped the Wyoming hills. Where once silence had ruled laughter, now spilled from open windows. The rebuilt barn no longer stood as a reminder of storm and ruin, but as a place of gathering, its wide doors swinging open each morning to welcome a dozen children with patched clothes and bright eyes. Inside, Clara had transformed the space into a small schoolroom. Rough benches lined the walls, a blackboard leaned against a post, and chalk dust floated like sunlight caught in the air. She guided young hands across slates, her voice patient as she coaxed out letters and sounds. For many of the children, her lessons were their first chance at learning to read and write. Mothers brought jars of preserves or loaves of bread in gratitude. Fathers tipped their hats and left baskets of apples. Emma was the proudest helper of all. Braids bouncing, she hurried from desk to desk, carrying chalk and showing the younger ones how to spell their names. "I'm Mama's helper," she declared often, her voice bright with pride. The title sat so naturally on her lips that townsfolk no longer questioned it. To them, Clara was not the widow who had come begging for work, but the woman who had given the valley something it had not known before, a future. Matthew, too, had changed. Where once his words were few, now he lingered in the evenings to share stories of the day, how many cattle had wandered too far, how the men grumbled at mending fences in the cold. Sometimes, when Clara read aloud to the children, he joined in his deep voice, turning the Psalms into something more than recitation, grounding them with gravity and grace. The hearth, once lit only for necessity, became the heart of the home. Emma sprawled on the rug, humming tunes, while Clara mended socks, and Matthew smoked his pipe nearby. Shadows of grief still lingered in the corners, but they no longer ruled the house. Instead, harmony lived here in the past and the present, sorrow and hope stitched together like the pieces of fabric Clara had hung on the wall. Side by side, the embroidered handkerchief with Anna's name and the square Clara had stitched herself, her initials entwined with Emma's, rested in quiet balance. One golden summer afternoon, as the children scattered after lessons, Emma rushed into the house with her cheeks flushed from play. She threw her arms around Clara's waist, her voice muffled in her skirts. "Mama, will you tuck me in like before, even if I'm too big now?" Clara bent low, pressing a kiss to the crown of her daughter's head. Her answer was steady, though her voice trembled with tenderness. "As long as I breathe." At the doorway, Matthew leaned against the frame, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. His eyes, once hard as stone, softened as he watched the two most precious pieces of his life hold on to each other. "This house," he said quietly, almost to himself, "finally feels alive again." That evening they sat together on the porch. The sun dipped behind the ridgeline, bathing the valley in copper and rose. Matthew smoked his pipe. Clara's hands moved steadily over her mending, and Emma hummed a tune as she sprawled across their laps. The air smelled of lilacs, warm bread, and summer dust. Beyond the porch, the land stretched wild and untamed, but within these walls they had carved out something rarer than wealth, peace. They had all carried storms within them, once grief, loneliness, and silence heavy enough to bury hope. But together they had built something that outlived loss, a home, bound not by blood alone, but by choice, devotion, and love that refused to break. The story of Clara Matthew and Emma is more than a tale of the Old West. It is a reminder for us all. Life has a way of wounding, of taking from us the things we thought we could never live without. Loss can leave us cold and wary, shutting out the world. But healing comes when we dare to open the door again, when we risk kindness, risk belonging, and risk love, even when it frightens us. Clara found her place not by clinging to what was gone, but by offering her heart again. Matthew learned that loving again was not betrayal, but a way of honoring the past while embracing the present. And Emma, through her child's plea for warmth, reminded them both that family is not always given, but chosen. So let their story whisper to you tonight. Love is not the end of grief, but the light that carries us through it. If this tale touched your heart, I invite you to share your thoughts below. Who in your life has reminded you that love can be chosen anew? And if you'd like more stories of hope, resilience, and devotion, subscribe and journey with us into the next frontier, where every sunset carries another story worth remembering.